The words came out of Harriet Keene like something that had been buried deep inside her chest for years, finally clawing its way to the surface on a cold October evening in 1883, on the porch of a ranch house that smelled like cedar smoke and dried sage. "You should know something about me, Isaiah," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that her hands were not. "Everyone leaves. My father left before I could say his name properly. My mother left when I was 9, not by choice but by fever, which is almost worse because she didn't want to go and still she went. The man I was set to marry in Kansas City left 3 days before the wedding with a woman who had softer edges than I do. Every situation I have ever trusted has dissolved. So if you are building towards something here, if this is the part where you tell me you want more than a housekeeper and a cook, then you ought to know you are walking into a place where the ground has already caved in more than once." She said it like a warning. She said it like a woman who had armed herself with honesty because every other weapon had already been taken from her. Isaiah Rourke stood with one boot resting on the bottom porch rail, his hat pushed back off his forehead, the dying sun catching the line of his jaw. He was not a man who spoke quickly. He was not a man who spoke recklessly. He had built a ranch in the high country of Colorado from raw land and raw will, and he did not do anything without meaning it completely. He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the yard. A horse shifted in the barn and settled again. The whole world held its breath. "Then watch me choose you every morning," he said. Not a promise dressed up in poetry. Not a man trying to sound like something he had read in a dime novel. Just those 7 words, delivered the way he drove a fence post, with full weight and no wasted motion, straight into the ground where they would hold. Harriet's breath caught. Her eyes went sharp and glassy at the same time, the particular look of a person who has been handed something they do not know how to carry. And that was the moment. That was the fault line between everything that had come before and everything that was about to begin. But to understand why those words broke something open in Harriet Keene, you have to go back. You have to go back to August of that same year, to the dust and heat, and the desperate circumstances that had driven her to a Colorado mountain ranch in the first place, carrying nothing but a carpetbag, a cracked leather journal, and a heart that had been folded so many times it had gone thin at the creases. Harriet Keene was 26 years old in the summer of 1883, and she had been surviving for so long that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to simply live. She had grown up in Illinois, in a town small enough that everyone knew the shape of everyone else's sorrows. Her father, Thomas Keene, had been a charming, restless man who loved his daughter fiercely in the brief intervals between disappearing. He went west when Harriet was 5, promising gold in return, and delivered neither. Her mother, Clara, had worked herself into an early grave taking in laundry and mending, and had managed to give Harriet a solid education and a fierce sense of self-reliance before the fever took her in the winter of Harriet's 9th year. After that, Harriet had been passed between her mother's sister in Illinois and a distant cousin in Missouri, always with the particular weight of someone who is loved out of obligation rather than desire. She was a quick student, a hard worker, and she learned early that the best way to make yourself indispensable was to need nothing and offer everything. She cooked and cleaned and helped in whatever house she lived in. She read every book she could get her hands on. She developed opinions and kept most of them to herself, because she had learned that a woman with opinions made people uncomfortable, and an uncomfortable person sometimes decided they had no room for you after all. At 21, she had taken a position as a school teacher in a small town outside Kansas City, and it was there she had met Edward Marsh, a lawyer's clerk with good teeth and warm eyes who had courted her with genuine tenderness for 2 years. She had let herself believe in him. She had made herself a dress for the wedding. She had written to her aunt in Illinois with the kind of careful happiness that doesn't want to jinx itself. Edward Marsh had left 3 days before the wedding. He had left with Mary Ellen Holbrook, who was softer and quieter, and who did not apparently have opinions that made a man feel like he was being assessed while he was trying to relax. He had left without a note. He had simply not appeared one morning, and the whole town had known before Harriet did, which was the particular cruelty that stayed with her longest. She had finished out her teaching contract. She had not cried in public. She had packed her things with a precision that frightened the women who watched her do it, because they expected collapse and got composure instead. And composure in the face of that kind of betrayal made people nervous in a way they could not name. She had spent the next 2 years drifting between teaching positions, moving when contracts ended, not putting down roots because roots required believing a place would hold you. She was in Denver in the spring of 1883, having finished a year-long position, when she saw the advertisement in the Rocky Mountain News. Wanted, capable woman of good character to serve as housekeeper and cook on working cattle ranch outside Ridgway, Colorado. Accommodation and fair wages provided. Apply by letter to Isaiah Rourke, Elk Creek Ranch, Ridgway, Colorado. It was not a mail-order bride advertisement. She checked twice because she wanted to be certain. It was a working position, a professional arrangement. Harriet Keene had no particular objection to professional arrangements. They were honest. They did not pretend to be something they were not. She wrote a letter that was precise and factual and unadorned. She listed her skills, which were considerable. She mentioned her education. She did not mention Edward Marsh or the wedding dress or the way a whole town had watched her swallow a humiliation that would have broken someone with less backbone. Isaiah Rourke had written back within 2 weeks. His letter was also precise and factual and unadorned, which she noted with something close to appreciation. He ran a cattle operation of around 300 head, he explained. He had a ranch hand named Pete Dalloway who slept in the bunkhouse and helped with the heavy work. He needed someone to manage the domestic side of the ranch, the cooking, the preserving, the mending, the keeping of accounts for the household. He offered $25 a month, a private room, and Sundays free. He did not ask about her marital history or her family or whether she could smile pleasantly at people she disliked. He asked if she could cook for men who worked hard and if she could keep ledgers in order and if she was prepared for winters that lasted longer than she probably expected. She had written back that yes, she could do all of those things, and she had not told him that she had never been to the mountains and that the prospect of altitude and isolation and 6-month winters both terrified and attracted her in roughly equal measure. She had arrived in Ridgway by stagecoach on the 14th of August, 1883, having traveled from Denver on roads that grew steadily more uncompromising as the mountains closed in around them. She had watched the landscape change through the stagecoach window with the focused attention of someone committing a map to memory, because if you knew the terrain you were less likely to be lost by it. Ridgway was a small town in the Uncompahgre Valley, more functional than pretty, with a main street of wooden-fronted buildings and the permanent smell of horse and sawdust and industry. The mountains rose on all sides with a kind of indifference to human ambition that Harriet found both humbling and clarifying. Isaiah Rourke had been waiting at the stage station. She had known him immediately, not because he matched some internal picture she had constructed, but because he was the only man standing there with the particular stillness of someone who has arranged to meet a stranger and has decided to simply wait without performing the waiting. He was taller than she had imagined, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who actually uses his body for work rather than for show. He had dark hair with a thread of early gray at the temples, brown eyes that were direct without being aggressive, and a face that the sun and wind had worked on enough to give it character. He was 32 years old, she knew from his letter, though he looked like a man who had lived every one of those years with attention. He shook her hand with the same directness that had been in his letters. "Miss Keene," he said. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "Wagon's here. I can take your bag. I can carry it." "I know you can," he said, without any of the irritation or the faint amusement that usually accompanied men who had that particular response turned back on them. He simply nodded and went to unhitch the horse's lead rope from the post, and Harriet Keene stood for a moment looking at the back of a man who had said, "I know you can," as if it were simply a fact and not a concession, and felt something very small and careful unlock inside her. Elk Creek Ranch was 12 miles out of Ridgeway, up into the mountains along a road that required concentration and good horses. Isaiah drove with the economical ease of a man who had made this trip hundreds of times, and he did not fill the silence with chatter which Harriet appreciated. They exchanged practical information. He told her the layout of the ranch, the schedule of meals, what stores he had on hand. She asked about the spring cellar and the state of the account books, and he answered her questions with the same directness he had applied to everything else. The ranch itself was modest and solid, a main house of 2 stories built from local pine, with a covered porch along the front, a barn of good construction, a bunkhouse to the east, an outbuilding that served as a smokehouse and root cellar combined. There were kitchen gardens that had grown somewhat wild from inattention, and an apple tree that had done better than anyone might have expected at this elevation. The mountains rose behind it, all with the particular quality of things that have always been there and will always be there, which was either comforting or overwhelming depending on the state of your internal landscape. Pete Dalloway was the ranch hand, and he was 38, lean and weathered, with the comfortable manner of a man who expects very little from life and is therefore pleasantly surprised by most of it. He had touched the brim of his hat at Harriet and said, "Ma'am," and she had said, "Mr. Dalloway," and they had understood each other immediately in the way of 2 people who are both essentially private and have no intention of making anyone else's life more complicated. Harriet's room was on the 2nd floor of the main house. It had a window that looked east toward where the mountains showed their first light in the mornings, and a decent bed, and a washstand, and space enough for her carpetbag and her journal, and the small stack of books she had brought with her. It was, she thought, more than sufficient. It was, she thought without quite saying it to herself, something close to quiet that she had not felt in a very long time. She had been at the ranch 2 weeks when she began to understand that Isaiah Rourke was not a straightforward man in the way she had initially assessed him. He was straightforward, yes, in his dealings, in his word, in the way he met a problem directly and solved it without drama. But he was also a man with a hidden layer, not a dark or deceptive layer, but a deep one. The kind of depth that a person develops when they have thought seriously about things that most people prefer not to think about. She found this out in pieces, the way you find out most true things about a person. The first piece was the library. In a study off the main hall, there was a bookcase that ran floor to ceiling along one wall, and the books on it were not the books of a man who kept books for show. They were read books. They had cracked spines and turned down pages and occasional pencil marks in the margins. There was Dickens and there was Shakespeare, and there was a worn copy of Thoreau's Walden, and there were agricultural texts, and a history of the Colorado Territory, and several volumes on animal husbandry and range management. There was also, tucked at the end of one shelf, a book of poetry by Walt Whitman that had been read so many times the cover had gone soft as cloth. Harriet had been dusting in the study when she found the Whitman. She had held it for a moment longer than the dusting required. She had set it back precisely where it had been. That evening at supper, which they took together at the kitchen table while Pete ate in the bunkhouse by preference, she had said without preamble, "You have a copy of Leaves of Grass." Isaiah had looked up from his plate. "I do. I didn't expect that." "What did you expect?" She had considered the question honestly. "Stock journals, maybe a Bible, agricultural texts." "I have those too." "I know, I've been organizing them." He had gone back to eating for a moment. Then he had said, "My mother sent me that book when I first came out here, said it would remind me why the work was worth it." He paused. She was right. Harriet had thought about that for a long time afterward. A man who built a cattle ranch in the Colorado mountains and kept a worn copy of Whitman's poetry because his mother had been right about why the work was worth it. She had revised her initial assessment slightly, in the direction of more. The second piece came 3 weeks after her arrival, in the form of a wagon rolling in from Ridgway carrying a man named Gerald Hatch, who was the agent for the Colorado Land and Cattle Company, and who wore a suit that was too good for mountain country and a smile that worked harder than it needed to. Harriet had been in the kitchen when Hatch arrived, but the window was open and voices carried. She had not meant to listen, but she had, because the tone of Hatch's voice was the particular tone of a man who has come to apply pressure disguised as friendliness. The Colorado Land and Cattle Company, she gathered, wanted Elk Creek Ranch. They had been acquiring land in the valley for 2 years, consolidating holdings, bringing in outside capital, moving toward the kind of large-scale operation that made sense to investors in the East and increasingly uncomfortable realities for the small ranchers it was built on top of. Hatch was offering a price that he described as fair, and that Isaiah's silence suggested he considered something else entirely. "You're sitting on prime grazing land, Rourke," Hatch said. "Water rights that the company would put to full use. You've been running this place alone with one hand for 3 years. That's not sustainable, and you know it." "It's been sustainable for 3 years," Isaiah said. "You had a bad winter last year. Lost, 40 head?" A silence. "That information is not public record. The company does its research." Hatch's voice had the smooth satisfaction of a man who believes information is the same thing as power. "We're prepared to offer you $14,000 and the option to stay on as a foreman if you'd like to continue working the land. I built this ranch. I don't work for other people on land I built." "Mr. Rourke, I've heard your offer, Mr. Hatch. I'll think on it. That's all I have for you today." There was a long pause, and then the sound of boots on the porch steps and a wagon being turned around, and then Isaiah had come into the kitchen with the particular set of his jaw that Harriet was beginning to recognize as controlled anger. He had stopped when he saw her at the counter. He had looked at her for a moment, and she had thought he might say something sharp about the open window. Instead he had said, "They've been at 3 other ranches in the valley, 2 of them sold, and the third, holding on." He had poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "So am I. Is the ranch in real financial trouble?" He had looked at her with an expression that was not offended but was evaluating. "Why do you ask it that directly?" "Because I'm keeping your household accounts, and if the ranch fails, I lose my position. Also because you look like a man who would rather have the honest question than have someone dance around it." Something had shifted in his expression then. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "The ranch is not in trouble. Last winter was hard, but we're solvent. Hatch is working from rumor and assumption, which is what that company does. They prefer to buy distressed properties at distressed prices, so they work to create the impression of distress first." "That's a very old strategy," Harriet said. "It is. Are you going to be able to hold them off?" "That," he said, "is what I'm working on." She had gone back to her work. He had taken his coffee to the study. But something had changed between them in that exchange. Some invisible renegotiation of the distance between employer and employee. Some small but significant admission that they were, on some level, in this together. September came in cool and golden, and with it came the rhythm of ranch life that Harriet found herself falling into with a kind of surprised gratitude. She was not a woman who had expected to find comfort in physical work, but there was something about the relentless practicality of it, the preserving and the cooking and the mending and the garden harvesting and the account keeping, that settled her mind in a way that the more contemplative work of teaching had not always managed. There was always something specific to do, and when you did it, it was done, and the evidence of it was visible and real. She and Isaiah had begun to take their evening meal with the conversation of people who are genuinely interested in each other's thinking rather than just filling silence. They talked about the land, about the company's maneuvers in the valley, about books they had both read, about the nature of things. He told her about coming to Colorado 8 years ago from a farm in Ohio, with money saved from 3 years of trail driving and a clear picture of what he wanted to build. He told her about the first winter, which had nearly killed him not from cold but from loneliness, and he said it plainly, without embarrassment, as a fact of his experience. She told him about teaching. She told him about the children she had taught, about the particular satisfaction of watching a child move from confusion to understanding, about the frustrations of systems that valued order over curiosity. She did not yet tell him about Edward Marsh. She was not ready for that, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. She did tell him one evening about her father. She was not sure why it came out then, but it did. Something about the way the October light was falling on the mountains, and the way Isaiah had been talking about his own father, who had died when Isaiah was 17 and left him the Ohio farm that he had eventually sold to come west. "My father chose leaving," she said, repeatedly. "He chose it the way some men choose whiskey because the pull of the next thing was stronger than whatever they had." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. "Do you know where he is now? Dead, I assume. I haven't heard from him in 20 years. She said it without dramatics. "I stopped waiting to hear from him somewhere around the age of 13. I'm sorry. It's the truth of it. I'm not sorry anymore. I've just incorporated it." He had looked at her then with something she could not quite read, a kind of careful attention that was more than politeness and less than pity, something that was closer to witness, as if he were seeing her completely and was not going to look away. It was in October, as the aspens were turning gold and the first real cold was coming down off the mountains at night, that the situation with the Colorado Land and Cattle Company took a darker turn and introduced a new threat into the hidden dangers already circling Elk Creek Ranch. A man named Cutter Briggs arrived in the valley. He was not an agent in a nice suit. He was the kind of man that companies sent when they wanted pressure applied in ways that couldn't be documented. He was in his 40s, with the particular blankness of a man who has stopped having feelings about what he does, and he had a history in the territory that Pete Dalloway summarized in 6 words when he told Isaiah about it in the barn. He works for whoever pays most. Cutter Briggs had already visited 2 of the remaining holdout ranches in the valley. One of them, the Larson place to the north, had experienced a fence line cut and a small grass fire that had burned 20 acres before it was put out. The other, the Whitfield operation to the east, had had 2 horses go missing in a single night. The pattern was clear. It was intimidation with evidence of capability, the kind of dark past that didn't need to announce itself because its work announced it. "We can make things worse, and we will, and you will not be able to prove we did it." Isaiah told Harriet about Briggs over supper the night Pete brought the information in, and he did not soften it or protect her from the details, which she noted and appreciated. "So the company is moving from offers to threats," she said. "That appears to be the direction. What are you going to do? Be alert. Document everything. Make sure Ridgway's sheriff knows what's happening in the valley." He paused. "And I've written to the Denver attorney who handled my original land claim. There are water rights attached to this property that the company needs and cannot legally acquire without my consent, even if they purchase the surrounding land. My attorney thinks that puts me in a stronger position than the company wants to admit." Harriet absorbed this. "What about until the legal matter is resolved? That could take months." "It could. And in the meantime, Briggs is out there doing whatever it is Briggs does." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that if you want to go back to Ridgway until this is resolved, I'll understand it. This is not what you signed on for." She had looked at him for a long moment, and something moved through her that was not quite anger and not quite determination, but was something built from both of them. She had been moved out of situations before, not always by choice, but always by force or circumstance or the absence of someone who was supposed to stay. She was tired of being the person who had to be removed for her own safety. She was tired of situations that collapsed before she was done with them. "I signed on to keep this ranch running," she said. "The ranch is still standing." "So am I." He had not argued with her. He had not told her she was brave or foolish. He had just looked at her with that careful, full attention and nodded once, and she had felt something settle between them that was more solid than anything she had felt in a very long time. The trouble came 3 weeks later, on a night in early November when the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the sky was clear and black with stars. Harriet was asleep when she heard the sound, a dry crack and then a rushing that was not wind. She was at her window in seconds, and she could see the orange light against the dark before she had fully processed what it was. The bunkhouse was on fire. She had her boots and her coat on before the thought was complete, and she was out the back door and running across the frozen yard, yelling Pete's name before her mind had fully caught up with her body. Isaiah appeared from the front of the house at the same moment, having heard it first from his own room, and he was running toward the well with the bucket that was always kept there. Pete was already out. He had woken fast, the way men who had spent time in dangerous places tended to wake, and he was out in the yard in his long underwear looking at the northeast corner of the bunkhouse, where the fire had caught on the woodpile against the outside wall. It took all three of them 40 minutes and every bucket of water the well could provide in a sustained effort to get the fire under control. They saved the bunkhouse, though the northeast corner was damaged badly enough to need substantial repair in the spring. Pete would sleep in the main house for the rest of the winter, on a cot in the kitchen, which he accepted with the practicality of a man accustomed to making the best of what was available. In the morning, they found the evidence. The woodpile had been soaked in something, lamp oil probably, and set. There were boot prints in the frozen mud that came from the north, the direction away from the road, and went back the same way. Deliberate, targeted, a message. Isaiah had stood in the yard looking at the damaged bunkhouse for a long time, and Harriet had stood beside him, and neither of them had spoken for a while because the situation did not require commentary, it required decision. "I'm writing to the sheriff today," he said. "Good. And I'm sending a telegraph to Denver." He paused. "And I'm going to the Larson place and the Whitfield place and talking to them directly about presenting a unified response to this." "They'll be more afraid now, not less," Harriet said. "Maybe, or they'll be angry enough to stop being afraid." She had looked at the burn marks on the old pine logs of the bunkhouse, and thought about how dark a motive had to be to send a man through a frozen night to set fire to a working ranch. And she had thought about secrets and traps, and how a man like Cutter Briggs was himself a kind of weapon, pointed at everything ordinary people tried to build. And she had felt, beneath the fear, which was real and she did not pretend otherwise, a hard, clear anger that she found strangely fortifying. "I'll ride with you to the Larson place," she said. "If their wife is there, another woman might help." He had looked at her with something that was almost startled, and then that almost smile again. "All right," he said. The ride to the Larson place was 9 miles north, through terrain that had gone spare and dramatic with the onset of winter, the aspens stripped bare, the grass yellow and flat, the sky an enormous pale blue that made everything under it feel both small and significant. They rode side by side on 2 of Isaiah's horses, and they talked as they rode, and it was on that ride that Harriet realized, with the particular surprise of something you didn't see coming even though it had been approaching for months, that she was deeply comfortable with this man. Not just professionally, not just situationally. Something that was more personal than comfort and more significant than ease. She recognized it the way you recognize a fact you had been avoiding, because facts have a way of not caring whether you are ready for them. She did not say anything about it on the ride. She was a practical woman. The valley was under threat, and there were more pressing things than the unwelcome discovery of her own feelings. But she filed it away with the precise care of a woman who keeps good records. Frank Larson was a lean, suspicious man in his 50s who had built his ranch from scratch the same way Isaiah had, and who had the look of a man whose trust had been burned once too often, but who was made of the specific material that, when pushed hard enough, pushes back. His wife, Rosa, was a practical, warm woman from New Mexico who fed them coffee and corn bread without being asked and sat down at the table to join the conversation without being invited, and Harriet liked her immediately and completely. The conversation was long and honest. Frank Larson was afraid, and he was honest about being afraid, and Isaiah respected him for it. But he was also angry, and anger was what Isaiah needed. By the time they left, 3 hours later, Frank Larson had agreed to ride to the Whitfield place himself and to put his name alongside Isaiah's on a formal complaint to the county sheriff, and if necessary, to the territorial governor's office. Rosa Larson had pressed Harriet's hand at the door and said, "You come back soon," in a tone that meant something more than politeness. Riding back, the afternoon light was going low and amber, and the cold had deepened. Isaiah had been quiet for a mile before he said, without particular preamble, "How are you managing all of this?" Harriet considered the question. "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "I think I was waiting for a situation that would ask something real of me." He had looked at her from under the brim of his hat with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of the kind of openness that most people are afraid to show. "You're not what I expected either," he said. "What did you expect? Someone capable, efficient, and that's what I expected," he said. "What I got was someone capable and efficient and considerably more than that." It was not a declaration. It was not a man sweeping a woman off her feet in a grand gesture. It was a statement of honest observation from a man who said what he meant, and it landed in Harriet's chest with more force than any elaborate speech could have managed. She had looked straight ahead at the mountain trail and said, "I could say the same about you," and felt the tips of her ears go warm in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The legal matter moved through November with the slow grind of territorial law, which was not entirely satisfying in its pace, but was moving. Isaiah's Denver attorney had confirmed that the water rights issue was genuine and significant, and that the Colorado Land and Cattle Company's legal counsel knew it, which was why the physical pressure campaign was happening. They needed the ranch quickly, before a legal challenge could be mounted. The longer Isaiah held, the worse their position became. Cutter Briggs made one more appearance in early December, riding up the road to Elk Creek Ranch in the middle of the day as boldly as a man who does not believe consequences apply to him. He did not get off his horse. He simply stopped in the yard and looked at the ranch house with the particular look of a man making calculations. Isaiah came out onto the porch. Harriet came with him because she had heard the hoofbeats from the kitchen and she was not the kind of woman who waited inside. Briggs looked at her with no particular expression and then looked back at Isaiah. "The company's final offer is $15,000, he said. "It's more than the place is worth." "Then they won't mind when I decline," Isaiah said. Briggs was quiet for a moment. His horse shifted under him and he corrected it with a slight movement of his knee, automatic and practiced. "Things can get harder to manage out here," he said. "Winter's long, accidents happen." "They do," Isaiah said. "Which is why I've made sure the sheriff in Ridgway has a written account of your name, your description, and your current location, and that my attorney in Denver has copies of the same." He paused. "And the territorial marshal's office in Pueblo has been contacted as well. I believe the marshal takes an interest in deliberate property destruction, which I imagine is a charge you'd prefer to avoid." Something moved behind Briggs's blank expression. It was not quite fear, but it was the cousin of caution. He looked at Isaiah for a long moment, then at Harriet, then back at Isaiah. "The company doesn't give up easy," he said. "Neither do I," Isaiah said. Briggs turned his horse and rode back down the road without another word, and Harriet had the clear instinct that it was not entirely over, but that something had shifted. The territorial marshal's involvement changed the stakes. Men like Briggs operated in the shadows where they could not be named. Daylight was dangerous for them. She had let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, standing there on the porch with the cold air sharp in her lungs, and Isaiah had turned to look at her and seen the breath go and had said, quietly, "You're all right." Not a question. A statement the same way he had said "I know you can" when she declined help with her bag in Ridgeway. A statement that was also, if you listened carefully, something closer to "I see you." She had said, "I am," and meant it entirely. December at Elk Creek Ranch was a siege of weather that had nothing to do with the Colorado Land and Cattle Company. The first real snowstorm came on the 7th, driving in from the northwest with the serious intention of a force that does not negotiate. They were snowed in for 4 days, and during those 4 days, something fundamentally changed in the texture of life at the ranch. Because snow and close quarters and firelight have a way of dissolving the careful professional distances that people maintain. Pete spent most of his time in the barn, tending the animals with the focused contentment of a man who prefers animal company in difficult weather, which left Isaiah and Harriet alone in the main house for long stretches of each day. They cooked together. They read in the evenings by the fire in the main room, separate books but the same warm circle of lamplight. They talked with the increasing ease of people who have stopped monitoring what they say. She read him a passage from Dickens one evening, and he read her a passage from Whitman in return, and there was something almost unbearably intimate about hearing that specific worn soft voice read the open words of that specific worn soft book while the snow came down outside. She told him about Edward Marsh during that 4-day snowstorm. Not all at once, but in the way truths come out when you have stopped defending yourself against them. She told him about the dress and the town knowing before she did, and the composed packing, and the specific private wound of being left without the dignity of an explanation. Isaiah had listened with complete attention the way he did everything, and when she was finished he had said, "He was afraid of you." Harriet had blinked. "I beg your pardon. A man who leaves like that without facing the person he's leaving. He was afraid of what you would say. He couldn't manage what you would have required of him, which was honesty, and he left instead of being honest because you are the kind of woman who would have required honesty, and he knew it." He paused. "That's about his weakness, not your edges." She had stared at him across the firelight for a long moment, and something had moved through her that was complicated and sharp and not entirely comfortable because it was the feeling of a truth you have been avoiding landing very precisely where it needed to land. "You say things very directly," she said, finally. "I've found it's more efficient. Most people don't find it efficient. They find it unsettling." "Do you find it unsettling?" She had thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I find it rare." He had looked at her in the firelight with that careful, open expression that he deployed so rarely and so precisely, and she had felt the warmth of it like the warmth of the fire itself, something real and present that was not performing anything. The snowstorm ended, and the valley returned to the clear, still cold of a Colorado winter, and the ranch's daily rhythms resumed, but they resumed slightly changed, the way a room looks slightly different after you have rearranged one piece of furniture. The professional distance that had never been very large had become smaller still, not inappropriately but honestly, in the way of two people who have stopped pretending they are less interested in each other than they are. She began to notice the particular ways he took care without making a production of it. He ensured that the firewood for the main house was always stacked and dry before anything else. He brought in extra lamp oil before she had to ask. When she was working late at the accounts, she would find a cup of coffee at her elbow that she had not made and had not heard being made. He did not announce these things. He simply did them, the way he did everything, with full intention and no fanfare. And she found herself doing the same in her own register. She noted that he preferred strong coffee and that he had a shoulder that troubled him in very cold weather, probably from an old injury never properly treated, and she adjusted the coffee accordingly and began warming a wrapped heated stone that she left near his chair without comment. She learned the things he liked to eat and made them without making it obvious she had learned them. She kept his study organized in the way he organized it himself, because she had taken the trouble to understand his system. It was a mutual and unspoken taking of care, and it was, Harriet thought, more romantic than anything Edward Marsh had ever done with flowers and carefully arranged compliments. Because it was real. It was grounded in actually seeing a person and responding to what you saw rather than to what you imagined. The legal resolution came in January, in the form of a letter from Isaiah's Denver attorney, informing him that the Colorado Land and Cattle Company had withdrawn its offer and its agents from the Uncompahgre Valley. The territorial marshal's investigation had found sufficient evidence of deliberate property destruction to make continued operations in the valley more expensive legally than the potential land acquisitions were worth. The company was pivoting to a different region. Cutter Briggs had moved on. Isaiah told Harriet at the supper table, reading the relevant portions of the letter aloud, and she had felt a relief so profound it was almost physical, the unwinding of a tension she had been carrying so long it had become part of her posture. "It's over," she said. "It is." He set the letter down. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight of a Colorado January evening, with snow packed against the outside walls and the stove making its small warm sounds, and he said, "I want to thank you." "For what specifically?" "For staying. For not leaving when I told you things might get difficult. For riding to the Larson place with me. For all of it." Harriet looked at her hands on the table for a moment. "I don't leave," she said, and heard the complicated weight of it as she said it. "Or rather, I have been left. It's not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I know the difference." The weeks after the threat was resolved were different in the way of things that have been tested and held. Something had been proven, not just about the ranch's resilience, but about what the two of them were together, and the knowledge of it sat between them with the comfortable solidity of something earned. They were in the habit now of sitting in the main room after supper, reading or talking, on opposite sides of the fireplace. And one evening in late January, Harriet had looked up from her book and found him looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the careful, attentive expression. Something more exposed than that. Something that had dropped the careful part and kept only the attention and added to it something she recognized because she had been feeling it herself for weeks and had been not quite allowing herself to call it by its name. "What is it?" she said. He had looked at his book for a moment, then set it on the arm of his chair. "I'm trying to determine whether what I want to say is something I should say. If it's honest, I'd rather hear it than not." He had looked at her then with the full weight of that direct brown gaze. "I think about you," he said, "considerably. In the way that I think about things that matter to me, not as an employee or a housekeeper, but as a person who I would find this place significantly diminished without." He paused. "I'm not certain of the proper way to say that given the circumstances." Harriet had felt the warmth move from her chest to her face and set her book down with equal deliberateness. "I think about you too," she said. "In the same way, I believe." It was not a declaration worthy of a dime novel. It was two careful, private, previously burned people telling each other a true thing in the plain language of people who do not have the luxury of being careless with words. And it was, in its way, the most significant conversation Harriet Keene had had in years. They did not do anything dramatic with the admission that evening. They had both lived too much life to rush at things just because they had been named. But the room felt different afterward, warmer in a way that was not the fire. And when they said good night at the foot of the stairs, there was a moment between the words that had not been there before, a pause that held something careful and new, and not yet ready to be anything more than acknowledged. February was cold and long and white, and in the long stretches of it, they read to each other more and talked more, and the conversations went deeper than they had gone before because the naming of what was between them had given them permission to be less guarded. He told her things he had not told other people. About the loneliness of the first years here, the particular grief of choosing isolation, and then finding it heavier than expected. About a woman he had known in his trail-driving years who had not waited for him to come back from a cattle drive, and who he understood now had been right not to wait because he had not been, at 23, a man who could be fully present for someone else. He had been still mostly a man in motion, heading towards something, and you could not ask someone to love a target. Harriet told him things she had not told other people. About the particular experience of being the kind of girl who was passed between households, who learned very young to make herself useful, because useful was a more reliable status than beloved. About the way that history had made her, on the one hand, extraordinarily capable and self-sufficient, and on the other hand, deeply uncertain of being wanted for herself rather than for what she could do. She had been hired here for her skills. She was aware of this. She was aware that she had been chosen for a function, and she was aware that what was growing between them was something different from and larger than that function, and she was also aware that she could not be entirely certain of the distinction. She said that last part out loud because she was a woman who said the true difficult thing out loud. Isaiah had been very still for a moment. Then he said, "I want to tell you something and I need you to hear it clearly. I'm listening. When you first arrived, I was looking for someone competent, and you are that. But what I have been thinking about since October has nothing to do with whether this household runs smoothly. It has to do with who you are, specifically, in particular, the way you think and the way you face hard things, and the way you are entirely yourself in a world that has given you considerable reasons not to be." He paused. "I would want you here if you could not cook a single meal. Is that clear enough?" Harriet had looked at him for a long time. She could feel the truth of it. She was a woman with excellent instincts for truth, shaped by years of needing to distinguish it from performance, and what she heard in his voice and saw in his face was truth of the specific variety that does not dress itself up. "Yes," she said, "that's clear enough." There was a Sunday in late February that was the first real break in the winter, a day when the temperature climbed above freezing, and the sun came out with something approaching intention, and the snow dripped from the eaves in a sound like the beginning of a conversation. Isaiah had knocked on the door of her room in the morning with entirely appropriate formality, and asked if she would like to ride out to a spot on the property he wanted to show her, if the trail was passable. She had said yes before he finished the question. The trail was passable barely, and they rode up through the pines above the ranch to a place where the trees broke, and the land opened up to a south-facing meadow. And from the meadow, you could see the whole valley spread below, and the mountains above and in between, the precise, miraculous, ordinary beauty of a winter day in the Colorado high country. They stopped their horses at the edge of the meadow and looked out at it in silence for a while, because it was the kind of place that asked silence of you. "I found this the first year I was here," he said. "I'd had a bad week and I rode until I found somewhere I couldn't see any of what I was struggling with, and I found this. I've been coming here ever since when I need to remember why it's worth it." Harriet looked out at the valley and the mountains and the enormous blue sky of a Colorado February, and felt something that was both larger and quieter than anything she had words for. She had been so many places in her life and had not allowed herself to belong to any of them, because belonging required a kind of trust that her history had made expensive. But something about this land and this sky and this man sitting on his horse beside her was making her want to try belonging again. She had turned to say something. She was not sure exactly what, and he had turned at the same moment, and they were closer than they usually were on horses side by side, and the thing she had been not quite calling by its name for weeks was right there in the space between them with nowhere else to go. Isaiah Rourke leaned forward slightly and kissed Harriet Keene with the same quality he brought to everything, direct and unhurried and entirely intentional, and she had kissed him back with everything she had been holding on to, which was considerable, and the horses were patient about it in the way of horses who have spent time around humans and have formed tolerant opinions. When they separated, she had her eyes open, and so did he, and she had thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "This is a man who is not afraid of what I am, not afraid of my edges or my opinions or the space I take up in a room, not made smaller by my capability. And she had thought, I am not going to ruin this by being afraid of it. I should tell you something, she said. Tell me. I have been afraid of this, not of you specifically, of the situation, of wanting something and having it leave. I know, he said. I'm telling you because I want you to understand why I might sometimes seem like I'm pulling back when actually I'm just fighting against old habits. He had looked at her with that full, open attention. I understand old habits, he said. I also understand that the cure for them is something different showing up repeatedly until the old pattern stops making sense. He paused. I intend to show up repeatedly. She had looked at him for a moment and then laughed, genuinely, the kind of laugh that is surprised out of you by something that is both funny and true. And the laugh had been, perhaps, as significant as the kiss, because Harriet Keene had not laughed like that in a very long time, the free, unguarded kind that doesn't check itself for appropriateness. Spring came the way spring comes in mountain country, slowly and then suddenly, the snow retreating up the slopes as the valley floor warmed, the creek running high with melt, the grass coming in green and the aspens leafing out with a delicacy that was almost implausible in a landscape that spent 6 months being severe. The ranch came alive with the work of a new season, and there was something clarifying about the physical demand of it, the calving and the fence repair and the kitchen garden going back in, the whole operation of a working ranch asserting itself after the long suspension of winter. Isaiah and Harriet moved between the practical and the personal with a naturalness that they were both somewhat astonished by, given their respective histories of complication and loss. They did not perform their feeling for each other. They simply had it in the daily texture of life on the ranch, in the conversations and the shared work, and the evenings by the fire and the occasional Sunday rides up to the meadow above the trees. In April, Isaiah had ridden to Ridgeway for supplies and had come back with a small package that he set on the kitchen table with deliberate casualness that did not fool Harriet for a single second. "What is that?" she said. "Something I found at the dry goods store." He was keeping his voice neutral, with visible effort. She had opened the paper wrapping to find a small book, a collection of poetry, Mary Wollstonecraft and then later Emily Dickinson, printed together in a slim volume that was newer than the Whitman upstairs and had not been read yet. The pages were clean and waiting. "Thank you," she said, and looked up at him, and he was watching her with that expression she had come to know so well, the one that was simply him, fully present and not pretending to be elsewhere. "There's something else," he said, and reached into his coat pocket and set a small thing on the table beside the book. A ring. Simple, silver, one small stone that caught the spring light from the kitchen window and held it. Harriet had looked at it for a long moment and felt the ground shift under her, not the terrifying, unstable shift of things collapsing, but the deeper shift of something settling into place that was meant to be there. "Isaiah," she said, and her voice was steady because she was choosing for it to be steady. "I have not been good at many things in my life," he said, "but I have been good at knowing what matters and not letting go of it once I've found it. And I want you to know something, Harriet." He said her name like it was its own sentence. "I know your history. I know what it has cost you to be willing to be here. I know that every time someone has made you a promise, the promise has eventually turned into a reason you needed to leave or be left." She could feel her throat tighten with the precision of a truth being told very carefully. "I am not going to tell you that I am different because everyone who has ever left someone has told them they were different first." He paused. "What I am going to tell you is that I will choose this. I will choose you. Not in one large gesture that covers everything and requires no further effort. Every morning, for as long as you will let me." She had stood in her kitchen on a spring afternoon in 1884 with a book of poetry and a silver ring on the table, and a man looking at her with a love that was not performing itself, and she had felt all of the carefully constructed defenses she had built over the previous 2 decades do something she had not expected. Not fall. They did not fall, because they were part of her and she was not going to disappear into anyone. But they became permeable, which was better, which was what she actually needed, something that could let him in without losing what she had built. "I am used to being left," she said. And there it was, the truest thing she knew about herself, said out loud in the clear air without apology. He had held her gaze without flinching. "Then watch me choose you every morning," he said. The words landed the way she told you about at the start, with the full weight of a man who means what he says and says it simply and stakes himself on it without needing anyone to applaud the staking. She had looked at him for a long moment, and then she had said, "Yes." They were married in June of 1884, in Ridgeway, in the small church on the north end of the main street that smelled like pine and old wood, and the particular combination of hope and history that old religious buildings tend to accumulate. Rosa Larson was there with Frank. Pete Dalloway was there in a clean shirt and a freshly blocked hat, looking uncomfortable in formal settings and deeply pleased about the occasion regardless. Isaiah's cousin had ridden down from Denver, a tall, cheerful woman named Margaret who had taken one look at Harriet and declared, "Thank God, someone with some sense," and hugged her with the warmth of a woman who has been waiting for this to happen for longer than the principals. Harriet had not made a new dress, not because she could not, but because she had found a fabric in the dry goods store that was a deep blue-green, the color of the pine trees against the mountains in certain lights, and she had made something from it that was entirely herself, not white and not traditional in any direction that required her to be smaller than she was. She wore her hair up with a single small white flower from the kitchen garden, and she had looked in the small mirror in the room they had let her use at the hotel to dress, and she had thought, with a clarity that was almost startling, "I look like a woman who is not afraid." Isaiah had looked at her when she came down the aisle of that small church the way a man looks at something he cannot quite believe has chosen him back, and she had thought, walking toward him, that this was the thing. This was the exact texture of the thing she had been building walls against for 20 years, and the walls were still there, but they were hers. They were built from her history and herself, and they did not have to keep everyone out to do their job. He had taken her hand at the altar with that characteristic directness of touch, not tentative, not performative, just present, and she had felt his hand around hers and thought, "This is what it feels like to be held by someone who is not going anywhere." They had said their vows in front of the preacher and the small gathering of people who mattered to them, and the Colorado mountains visible through the church's single east-facing window. And the words had meant everything they were supposed to mean, because they were being said by two people who had thought seriously about what they meant before they said them. The reception afterward was at the Larson Ranch, which Rosa had volunteered and turned into something warm and full of food, and the particular laughter of people who have made it through a hard time together. Frank Larson had opened a bottle of whiskey he had been saving since before the bad winter, and Pete had danced with Rosa twice and looked astonished at himself both times. And Margaret had given a speech that was brief and entirely honest and made Harriet laugh and Isaiah redden slightly and everyone else applaud. And then it had been evening and the mountains were going purple and the air was cooling toward the clean sharpness of a Colorado summer night. And Isaiah had brought the wagon around and they had driven back up the road toward Elk Creek Ranch in the long mountain twilight. And Harriet had sat beside him on the wagon seat and felt the solid reality of the life she was entering, not as a dream or a possibility but as a fact. "How does it feel?" he said as they turned onto the ranch road and the pines closed in on either side. "Different from what I expected," she said honestly. "Better or worse?" She had considered it. "Better," she said, "quieter than I expected." "The good feeling is very quiet." He had nodded, as if this made complete sense to him. "Solid things tend to be quiet," he said. The first year of their marriage had the texture of something being properly built, which was the best texture Harriet knew. They were not always easy with each other, because they were both people with strong convictions and direct tongues, and the kinds of histories that leave marks. And there were arguments, real ones, over real things, conducted with the full force of two intelligent people who were not afraid to have the argument about how to handle a dispute with a neighboring rancher over a shared fence line, about whether to take on a second ranch hand when the cattle herd grew to 400 head that spring, about a letter Harriet received in October from her mother's sister in Illinois, asking if Harriet might help with money, a request that was complicated by the history of the relationship and Harriet's ambivalence about the obligation. Isaiah had surprised her in that last argument by coming down firmly on the side of sending the money, not because he felt she owed it, but because he said, quite simply, that having a clear conscience about her family was worth $20, and that he would rather have her at peace than be $20 richer. She had looked at him after that and felt the particular moved quality of being seen correctly by the person who matters most to you. "You understand more about my history than I sometimes credit," she said. "I pay attention," he said, "to you specifically. It's not difficult." She had sent the money to her aunt in Illinois and felt the specific relief of a thing handled, and had gone to bed that night in the room she now shared with her husband, and thought about the word husband with the concentrated attention of a woman who is still slightly astonished by the fact of it. That first spring turned to summer and summer to fall, and by the second winter of their marriage there was new life growing in Harriet, which she confirmed to herself in December, and told Isaiah on a cold, clear morning while he was drinking his first coffee of the day at the kitchen table. He had looked at her for a moment with an expression that moved through several things quickly before landing on something that was very large and very quiet, and entirely without calculation. He had set down his coffee and stood up and taken her face in both his hands with the careful, specific tenderness of a man who is holding something irreplaceable and knows it. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you afraid?" "Both," she said. "Is that acceptable?" "That's exactly right," he said. "We'll be both of those things together." Their son was born in August of 1885, which was fitting because August was when Harriet had arrived at Elk Creek Ranch and August was when everything had begun. They named him Thomas for her father, which surprised Harriet when Isaiah suggested it, and she had looked at him and said, "Why would you suggest naming him for a man who left?" "Because you deserve to reclaim that name," he said. "Make it mean something different, something that stays." Thomas Rourke arrived on a warm August morning with the characteristic assertiveness of a person who has decided to be present in the world and is not going to be quiet about it. He was large and loud and deeply healthy, and Pete Dalloway, who had shown no previous interest in children, looked at him with the expression of a man discovering an entirely new feeling and said, "Well, that's something," in a tone that covered considerably more than the words. Harriet held her son in the afternoon light of the bedroom she shared with Isaiah and felt, alongside the exhaustion and the overwhelm and the physical fact of what had just happened, a clarity that she had not expected. She had been left and left and left again, and she had built walls and kept accounts and trusted practical arrangements over personal ones, and she had been entirely right to do all of it because it had kept her alive in the ways that mattered until she got here, to this room, to this man sitting on the bed beside her with his shoulder against hers looking at their son with the same full, present attention he brought to everything. "He looks very serious," Isaiah said, looking at the baby. "He is going to have opinions," Harriet said. "He comes by that honestly." She had laughed, and the laugh was the same free, unguarded kind she had first laughed in the meadow above the pines, and Isaiah had looked at her with that expression that was just him, fully there, and she had thought, every morning. He chooses this every morning. And so do I. Thomas grew into a boy of considerable personality, as Harriet had predicted. He was 2 years old and already definite about everything when his sister arrived in the spring of 1888, a girl they named Clara after Harriet's mother, who had deserved to be remembered by more than grief. Clara was a different child entirely, quieter and more observant, with Isaiah's steady brown eyes and Harriet's particular way of noticing things. The two of them together, Thomas charging and Clara watching, made the ranch house a different place, louder and fuller and more itself than it had been. Pete Dalloway, who had been around for all of it, had become something between an uncle and a permanent fixture of the ranch's human landscape. He had found himself, in the summer of 1887, in an unlikely correspondence with Rosa Larson's younger sister Alina, who lived in New Mexico and who had visited the valley once and apparently made an impression. They had exchanged letters for a year, which Pete managed with the same combination of practicality and surprising feeling that characterized everything he did, and Alina had eventually arrived in the valley in the fall of 1888 and made it definite and permanent within 4 months. Their wedding in early 1889 was a small affair that Isaiah and Harriet attended with the particular pleasure of people watching something they had hoped for come true. By 1890, Elk Creek Ranch had grown to 600 head of cattle and employed 3 ranch hands in addition to Pete, who had moved with Alina into a proper small house that Isaiah had helped him build on the northern section of the property. The kitchen garden had expanded into a proper kitchen farm, partly because Harriet had developed a genuine passion for it, and partly because a growing household could use the production. The study's bookcase had overflowed to a second bookcase, and then a third as both Harriet and Isaiah continued their reading and discussing and arguing about books with the relish of people who find the exchange of ideas a form of ongoing intimacy. The Colorado Land and Cattle Company had collapsed in 1889, as it turned out, undone by overextension and a shift in Eastern investment priorities that had nothing to do with the Uncompahgre Valley. The ranches that had sold to them were resold to new owners, some of them decent, some of them less so, and the valley went through several years of adjustment before settling into a new configuration. The Larson Place and Elk Creek Ranch remained the anchors of the valley's independent ranching community, and Frank and Rosa remained their closest friends, their families spending Sunday afternoons together with the comfortable regularity of people who have been through hard things together and have come out the other side still wanting each other's company. There was one afternoon in the fall of 1890, which Harriet would think of later as one of the specific perfect days, the kind that you cannot arrange. They simply arrive. It was a Sunday, one of those October Sundays that the Colorado mountains specialize in, with the aspens at their most astonishing gold and the air clear, and the sky that particular deep blue that makes everything under it look painted with purpose. She and Isaiah had ridden up to the meadow above the pines, just the two of them, the children with Rosa for the afternoon. They had stood at the edge of the meadow the way they had stood there before, looking out over the valley that was theirs to steward, that they had fought for and built and held, and she had felt the full settled weight of it. 7 years since she had stepped off a stagecoach in Ridgeway with a carpetbag and a cracked leather journal and a heart worn thin at the creases. 7 years of mornings chosen deliberately, of waking up in a bed that was hers with a man who was hers, and a house that was hers, and a life that she had not been moved out of or left behind in, or asked to make herself smaller to fit into. Isaiah had been standing beside her looking at the valley, and he had said, without turning to look at her, "What are you thinking?" "That I was wrong about one thing," she said. He had turned then with a small question in his expression. "I said I was used to being left. I believed it would always be that way, not as a complaint, just as a fact about the landscape of my life." She paused. It was not a permanent fact, as it turns out. He had looked at her for a long moment, this man who had become her whole country, and she had seen in his eyes the 7 years of mornings, each one of them chosen, each one of them specific, each one of them the opposite of leaving. "No," he said. It wasn't. She had taken his hand, and they had stood in the aspen gold and the mountain light and the enormous quiet of a place that had become home in the truest sense, the sense that is not about a building but about belonging, not about walls but about willingness, not about staying because you have nowhere else to go but staying because there is nowhere else you would rather be. And then she had said, because she was still and always would be a woman who said the true thing directly, "I love you, Isaiah Rourke. I love the specific particular fact of you, not the idea of someone steady but you, who is steady and exasperating and reads Whitman and makes sure I have coffee before I have to ask for it, and told me once that Edward Marsh was afraid of me and was entirely right." He had made a sound that was the closest thing she had heard from him to a laugh of surprised delight, which she treasured the way she treasured all rare things. "I love you, Harriet Rourke," he said. Specifically and particularly, and in the particular way of someone who was living half a life before you arrived with your carpetbag, and your opinions, and your absolute refusal to be anything other than exactly who you are. She had leaned her head against his shoulder in the October light, and he had put his arm around her, and they had stood there together looking out at the valley and the mountains and the long golden afternoon of a life that had been hard and complicated and fought for and was, at this moment, and at every moment that mattered, entirely and completely enough. When they rode back down the trail to the ranch in the late afternoon, Thomas was already running from the gate to meet them, loud and urgent about something that had happened with a barn cat and her kittens, and Clara was behind him more quietly with her father's steady eyes taking everything in, and Pete was coming in from the east pasture with two of the new hands, and the kitchen smoke was coming up from the house in the still air, and the mountains behind it were going amber and rose in the last of the light. It was a Tuesday when Isaiah Rourke chose Harriet. It was a Friday. It was every cold morning and every long summer evening and every October afternoon when the aspens turned and every winter night when the snow came down, and the fire was warm and the books were there, and the person beside him was fully herself and completely his. It was the morning of the third child, another son who came in the summer of 1892 and was named Elias, after Isaiah's father, a name Harriet said aloud several times to hear how it sat with her, and decided she liked. Elias, who arrived already quiet, who would grow up watching his brother's decisive charge through the world, with the particular appreciation of someone who has chosen a different approach. It was the morning in the winter of 1893, when Harriet woke before dawn with the clear knowledge that something was wrong, and found Isaiah not in the bed and not in the house, and found him in the barn with the mare who was foaling badly. And she had brought the lamp and held it without being asked, and the foal had been saved, and the mare had been saved, and they had come back inside in the cold gray pre-dawn covered in the honest mess of it, and Isaiah had looked at her across the kitchen table with pure feeling that did not need any words at all. It was the morning he brought her a wildflower from the south meadow for no reason other than it had been there, and he had thought of her. It was the morning she left his coffee on the study desk before he woke so it was there when he got there. It was the morning after a hard argument when they were both still and private about it, but he had set his hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed, and she had known without turning that it was both an acknowledgment and a repair, and that they were all right. It was the morning 15 years after she had arrived at Elk Creek Ranch, when Harriet stood at the kitchen window watching Isaiah cross the yard from the barn with Thomas at 12, already as tall as his father's shoulder, and Clara at 7 running to keep up, and Elias at 3 on Isaiah's shoulders looking at the world from a new elevation, with the expression of someone who has been given unexpected access to important information. And she had felt the full sum of all those chosen mornings add up to something that was not just her life, but the right life, the one that had been on the other side of all the leaving and the losses, the one that had required everything she had ever been in order to arrive. She had thought, standing there with the morning sun coming through the glass, about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a carpetbag and said to herself that she would not trust this, would not let herself want this because she was used to being left. And she had thought about a man who had looked at her and said, as simply as a fact, "Then watch me choose you every morning." He still did. That was the thing. He still did, in all the ordinary specific daily ways that constitute a life actually lived, not in the grand gesture but in the persistent presence, in the showing up, in the yes of it, day after day, winter and summer and spring, and the long golden falls when the aspens turned in the high country, and the valley was so beautiful it made your chest ache. She was not used to being left anymore. She was used to this. She was used to chosen, to staying, to the solid, quiet, good feeling of a life that had been built together on ground that held. Isaiah came through the kitchen door with Elias still on his shoulders and Thomas behind him, arguing something about the calves with the passionate investment of a 12-year-old, who has recently decided he knows more than anyone about cattle. And Clara came in after them and immediately went to the cupboard for the biscuit tin, because Clara was practical in the specific way of her mother, and the kitchen was suddenly entirely full of the particular noise and warmth of a family on an ordinary morning. Isaiah met Harriet's eyes across the room. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She saw him see her, and she saw the choosing in it, and she smiled, the free and unguarded kind, and he smiled back with everything he was. And the morning at Elk Creek Ranch continued in the Colorado mountains in the fall of 1898, ordinary and irreplaceable, held between the mountains like something worth keeping, which was exactly what it was.